Ed Sullivan stood in the wings of CBS Studio 50, watching Jim Morrison pace back and forth like a caged animal, muttering words that Ed couldn't quite understand. It was January 21st, 1968, and the Doors were scheduled to perform in 15 minutes when Ed realized he might have made the biggest mistake of his television career. 6 months earlier, Jim had defied Ed's censorship demands and sung "Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher" instead of the approved "Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Better," creating one of the most controversial moments in Ed Sullivan Show history. Now Ed had given the Doors a second chance, believing that Jim had learned his lesson about respect and professionalism. But watching Jim's glazed eyes and erratic behavior, Ed understood that tonight wouldn't be about redemption. It would be about witnessing the complete destruction of a brilliant artist who had chosen drugs and chaos over everything else in his life. Before you hear this tragic story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the night when Ed Sullivan watched genius destroy itself in real time on live television. To understand why Ed Sullivan's decision to give the Doors a second chance was so risky, you need to understand what had happened during their first appearance 6 months earlier, and how much worse Jim Morrison's condition had become since then. The Doors' September 1967 appearance had been a disaster that Ed still regretted, not because of the music, which was brilliant, but because of Jim's deliberate defiance of Ed's authority and his complete disregard for broadcast standards. The controversy had centered around the lyrics to "Light My Fire," specifically the line "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." Ed's standards department had insisted that the word "higher" be changed to "better" to avoid any reference to drug use, and the Doors had agreed to the modification during rehearsals. But when the cameras rolled, Jim had sung the original lyrics, deliberately violating the agreement and embarrassing Ed in front of 60 million viewers. "That Morrison boy is trouble," Ed had told his wife Sylvia after the September show. "He's talented, maybe even brilliant, but he's completely unreliable and seems to enjoy causing problems. I should never book them again." But the Doors' popularity had continued to explode in the months following their Sullivan appearance, partly because of the controversy itself. Their album sales had skyrocketed, their concerts were selling out instantly, and Jim Morrison had become the most recognizable face in rock music. Ed's bookers argued that the Doors were too big and too important to ignore, regardless of Jim's previous behavior. Everyone deserves a second chance, Ed's head producer had argued during a December 1967 meeting. Morrison was probably just nervous during the first appearance. He's a professional performer, and professionals learn from their mistakes. Besides, their new song "Hello, I Love You" is going to be massive. We need to be the show that presents it to America. Ed had been reluctant to give the Doors another opportunity, but the commercial realities were undeniable. The Doors were the hottest band in America, and the Ed Sullivan Show couldn't afford to ignore acts that guaranteed enormous ratings and cultural relevance. But what Ed didn't fully understand was how dramatically Jim Morrison's condition had deteriorated in the months since their first Sullivan appearance. The fame that had made the Doors superstars had also accelerated Jim's descent into alcohol and drug abuse that was destroying both his health and his ability to function as a professional performer. The Doors' January 21, 1968 appearance had been scheduled with unusual conditions designed to prevent a repeat of the September controversy. Ed's production team had insisted on multiple rehearsals with specific attention to lyrical content, and Jim had been required to sign a written agreement promising to perform all songs exactly as rehearsed, with no deviations or surprises. "This time there will be no misunderstandings," Ed had told the Doors' manager during the booking negotiations. "Jim Morrison will perform the songs as agreed, or the Doors will never appear on television again. This is his last chance to prove he can behave professionally." Jim had seemed to understand the gravity of the situation during the initial rehearsals 2 days before the broadcast. He had been relatively sober, focused on the music, and cooperative with the production staff. His voice was in good form, and the band's performance of "Hello, I Love You" and "People Are Strange" had been musically excellent. But on the day of the show, Ed's staff began noticing troubling signs that suggested Jim was in no condition to perform on live television. He arrived at the studio 3 hours late, claiming he had been exploring the city but clearly showing signs of alcohol consumption. His speech was slurred, his movements were unsteady, and his eyes had a glassy quality that suggested he was under the influence of more than just alcohol. "Jim doesn't look right," Ed's head producer warned him during the afternoon rehearsal. He's not the same performer who was here 2 days ago. He seems like he's on something, and I'm not sure he can deliver a professional performance tonight." Ed watched Jim during the rehearsal and had to admit that his producer was right. Jim's vocals were inconsistent, he seemed confused about basic staging directions, and he kept making strange comments that didn't relate to anything happening around him. This wasn't the focused, albeit rebellious, performer from September P's. This was someone who appeared to be having serious problems with substance abuse. "Maybe we should postpone," Ed's producer suggested. "We could say Jim has the flu or something. Reschedule for next month when he's in better condition." But Ed was trapped by the economics and logistics of live television. The show was going out to 60 million people in 4 hours. The other acts were already prepared and expecting to perform, and canceling the doors would create a hole in the broadcast that would be impossible to fill with quality replacement entertainment. "We'll monitor him closely and hope he can pull it together for the actual performance," Ed decided. Sometimes performers who seem problematic during rehearsal find their focus when the cameras roll. "We'll have to take the risk." As the evening progressed toward showtime, Jim's condition continued to deteriorate rather than improve. During dinner, he consumed what appeared to be several additional drinks, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. He had loud conversations with people who weren't there, made inappropriate comments to female staff members, and seemed to have lost track of where he was and why he was there. "This is going to be a disaster," Ed confided to his wife during a phone call an hour before airtime. "Morrison is completely out of it, but it's too late to cancel without destroying the entire show. I'm going to have to hope that some miracle occurs in the next 60 minutes. 30 minutes before showtime, Ed made the decision to confront Jim directly about his condition and the professional obligations he had accepted by agreeing to appear on the show. Ed found Jim in the Doors dressing room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, staring at the ceiling with an expression that suggested he was seeing things that weren't visible to anyone else. "Jim, we need to talk," Ed said, sitting down in a chair so he could make eye contact with the increasingly disoriented performer. "You're going to be on live television in 30 minutes, performing for 60 million people. I need to know that you understand what's happening and that you can deliver a professional performance." Jim looked at Ed with eyes that seemed to be having difficulty focusing. "Ed Sullivan," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "The great Ed Sullivan, guardian of American morality, protector of suburban values. Do you ever wonder what you're really protecting them from?" Ed realized he was having a conversation with someone who was not entirely present mentally. "Jim, I need you to focus on the performance. Can you sing 'Hello, I Love You' the way we rehearsed it? Can you remember the staging and the camera positions?" Jim laughed, but it was a hollow sound that contained no humor. "I can sing anything you want, Ed. I can be anyone you want. That's the problem. I'm so good at being what people want that I've forgotten who I actually am underneath all the performance." Ed felt a mixture of frustration and genuine concern for the young man who seemed to be having some kind of psychological breakdown right before his eyes. "Jim, if you're not capable of performing tonight, we can work something out. But I need you to be honest with me about your condition." "My condition," Jim repeated, his voice gaining an edge of anger. "My condition is that I'm trapped in this meat suit, performing for people who want to consume my soul and then throw away the bones. But don't worry, Ed. I'll give you a performance you'll never forget." Those last words sent a chill through Ed that he couldn't shake. Jim's tone suggested that he was planning something beyond a simple musical performance, something that might be dangerous for everyone involved. Ed left the dressing room deeply troubled, knowing that he was about to put someone on live television who was clearly in serious psychological and chemical distress, but unable to find any alternative that wouldn't destroy the entire evening's broadcast. At 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the Ed Sullivan Show went live to the nation. Ed did his opening monologue, trying to maintain his usual professional composure while privately dreading what might happen when the Doors took the stage. He introduced the first guests and tried to focus on the normal routine of live television, but his mind kept returning to Jim's disturbing comments and obvious impairment. Finally, it was time for the Doors performance. Ed walked to his mark and delivered what he hoped would be a routine introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, performing their hit song 'Hello, I Love You,' the Doors." The Doors took the stage, and for a moment Ed allowed himself to hope that the magic of live performance might somehow restore Jim's focus and professionalism. The other band members, Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore, were clearly concerned about Jim's condition, but they began the opening notes of Hello, I Love You with their usual musical precision. Jim stepped up to the microphone, and for the first verse everything seemed relatively normal. His voice was slightly less powerful than usual, and his movements were somewhat unsteady, but he was singing the correct lyrics and staying roughly within the planned performance structure. But as the song progressed, Ed could see that Jim was losing his battle with whatever substances were affecting his judgment and perception. His vocals became increasingly erratic. He began making strange gestures that had nothing to do with the choreographed performance, and his facial expressions suggested he was experiencing something that had nothing to do with the song he was supposed to be singing. Then during the second verse, Jim did something that no one had anticipated and that would haunt Ed Sullivan for the rest of his career. Instead of singing the lyrics to Hello, I Love You, Jim began reciting what sounded like poetry or stream of consciousness thoughts about death, cosmic consciousness, and the meaninglessness of existence. The cameras are rolling, but nobody's home. Jim chanted into the microphone, his voice becoming increasingly distorted and alien. We're all just meat puppets dancing for the entertainment of ghosts. Can you see them out there, Ed? Can you see the dead people in the audience? Ed felt his blood turn cold as he realized that 60 million Americans were watching Jim Morrison have what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown on live television. The other members of the Doors had stopped playing, clearly having no idea how to respond to Jim's departure from reality. But Jim wasn't finished. He grabbed the microphone stand and began using it as a prop for an improvised performance that seemed to be equal parts religious ceremony, political protest, and psychiatric emergency. "This is your brain on American dreams," Jim shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. "This is your soul on celebrity worship. This is what happens when you try to turn shamanic ecstasy into prime-time entertainment." Ed realized he had to make an immediate decision that would either save his show or destroy it completely. He could cut to commercial and try to salvage the broadcast, or he could let Jim continue his disintegration in front of the entire nation. For reasons he would never fully understand, Ed chose to let the cameras keep rolling. Perhaps he recognized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of live television. Perhaps he felt some obligation to document Jim's breakdown rather than hide it from public view. Or perhaps he was simply frozen by the magnitude of what was happening. Jim performed for another 90 seconds, delivering what could only be described as a real-time artistic suicide. His words became increasingly disconnected from conventional meaning, his movements became more violent and self-destructive, and his entire presence suggested someone who had crossed a line from which there might be no return. When Jim finally collapsed onto the stage, apparently exhausted by his own intensity, the studio audience sat in stunned silence. The Doors' other members rushed to check on Jim, who seemed to be conscious but completely disconnected from his surroundings. Ed walked onto the stage, knowing that millions of people were waiting to see how he would handle this unprecedented situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ed said into the camera, his voice steady despite the chaos around him, "what you've just witnessed is a young man who is clearly in need of help. Jim Morrison is a talented artist who appears to be struggling with personal demons that have overcome his ability to perform professionally. Our thoughts and prayers are with him and his family." The aftermath of Jim Morrison's breakdown was immediate and overwhelming. CBS received thousands of phone calls from viewers who were shocked, concerned, and confused by what they had said. "I watched a brilliantly talented young man destroy himself in front of the entire nation," Ed reflected years later. "I could have cut away, but I chose to let America see what fame and drugs can do to genuine artistic gifts." The story serves as a powerful reminder about the human cost of fame and the responsibility that comes with providing platforms for artists struggling with personal demons they cannot control. If this tragic story moved you, hit that subscribe button and tell us, how do we balance artistic freedom with personal responsibility? Sometimes giving someone a second chance means watching them destroy themselves in front of everyone who believed in them.